All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this next year development discourse session with Professor Stefan Dercon. Next year is a multi-competency public policy advisory firm. We're excited to have Professor Dercon with us to discuss or to help us understand why Nigeria has failed to develop at pace and how we can get Nigeria's elites to gamble on development. Over the next 2 hours or thereabout, we'll have Professor Dercon present some opening remarks for about 15 to 20 minutes. Then I'll invite Dr. Sam Amadi, and I'll introduce him appropriately at the time. And we'll have a moderate conversation. Following that moderate conversation, we'll open it up for audition. For the audience, if you can please type your question in section and we'll put. And without further ado, I'm a British economist and professor of economic policy at the Blavatnik School of Government and the Department of Economics at the University of Oxford. He's also the director of the Center for the Study of African Economies. From 2011 to 2017, he was the chief economist at the UK Department for International Development. Before that, he was professor of development economics at Oxford and lead academic for the Ethiopian country program at the International Growth Center, a research center in the UK. And between 2000 and 2002, he was program officer at the World Institute of Development Economics, United Nations University, where he led their research program on insurance against poverty. Before that, he had done some more scholarly work. And he's the author of the book that we're discussing today, Gambling on Development, Why Some Countries Win and Others Lose. And without further ado, I'd like to invite Professor Dercon to give his opening remarks.
Well, thank you very much. Look, I wrote this book probably with two hats. I've worked as an academic for 30 years, largely studying Africa. But also probably in like 15, 20 years, also doing studies in Asia. And, moving from Africa to Asia, you start seeing change. And it puzzled me, why some countries making progress or not, also academically. But then I worked in the policy space. I worked as chief economist of DFID, the UK's International Development Agency. I also worked as a development advisor to successive foreign secretaries. This was after the abolition of DFID into the foreign ministry in the UK. I worked in the policy thing. I mean, for my sins, I have to admit, given that she's just resigned, I did advise Liz Truss, and I can understand why she couldn't bottle it. She's just resigned in the UK. So, It's very hard to be an advisor on development if people don't take advice. But I learned a lot in these last 10 years working in the UK government. And it puzzles me. You have on the one hand all the academic things that as an academic you do, as an economist do, and you have a good sense of, what needs to happen and what ought to happen and what other kind of things. And then you look around the world and you actually say, well, progress is very heterogeneous. There's very different progress. And so the minimal amount of thing that I want to start with as a stylized fact, this is a world where there's been a lot of progress in the poorest countries in recent times. The last 2-3 decades, there's been dramatic progress, for example, in extreme poverty in the world, from about 2 billion in the way the World Bank doing it as good as it can, and I would defend it the way they try to do it, around 1990, about 2 billion people. Now we brought it back to about maybe 650 million people. So that's a reduction by 2/3. Now, most of that reduction happened, of course, in Asia. You've got China going from 800 million extreme poor in 1990 to probably less than 50 million today. You have Indonesia making lots of progress. You even in India after 2000 making a lot of progress. Actually, in Africa, the picture is a bit different. In aggregate, especially sub-Saharan Africa, we are actually at slightly larger numbers now than we were in 1990. Doesn't mean as a share of the population. Of course, population has increased. The share of the population in extreme poverty has probably gone down, but the number of extreme poor people is probably now somewhere around 500, 550 million people in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, but it goes further. even in sub-Saharan Africa, and then we'll come to the crux of it, we see differences now. We don't see a steady pattern. So you actually now get, yes, slight increases in total numbers of extreme poor. We actually predict, most people that look at these forecasts, they look by 2030, 90% of the extreme poor lives in sub-Saharan Africa. But it hides the fact that there's a couple of countries, such as Ghana or Ethiopia, have halved their number of extreme poor since 1990. And then there are countries that have doubled it. And which one is on top of that league table? Nigeria. Nigeria is actually the place where we now get, as at an event in Lagos, in fact, Chief Obasanjo was actually calling it the Nigerianization of poverty. And in fact, all predictions would suggest that by 2030, Nigeria will be the country in the world with the largest number of extreme poor people, overtaking India with a population that is 5 times as big of the population of Nigeria. But the number of extreme poor people will predominantly live, first of all, in Nigeria, then in the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, then Madagascar, and then places like Malawi and so on. So you get differentiation also in Africa. Now, that makes it really interesting and maybe less depressing in some sense, in that actually progress even in Africa has been happening. Now, the question is a little bit, why is it that some countries have been making this progress and other countries haven't? And I think that's in the book what I'm trying to, in first instance, look at. Now, there's a lot of people have written about this, endless books about it. But if you look at it, economists like to say, it's about what needs to be done and what has been done and what hasn't been done. And then you look at it and some people would say, well, it's all about the institutions. It's about structures. It's about history. It's about colonialism. Now, that doesn't help us to explain the difference, say, between Nigeria and Ghana or Ethiopia. Yeah, okay, not colonized, but you also get East African countries that are doing much better than they used to be relative to, say, other places. Actually, the institutional explanations, a bit like the why nations fail type of thing from those who have followed that literature, Acemoglu and Robinson, is a tricky one because, yes, of course, institutions and history matter, and institutions are indeed shaped through history. But actually, countries with somewhat similar histories, like Indonesia, with a terrible colonial time, with natural resources, with all kinds of stuff, seems to have progressed, where a place like Nigeria didn't. So there's differences even for similar institutional histories. So where does it come down to? Well, it's maybe an old-fashioned thing to say, well, countries seem to have different actions after behaviors of the leadership. It's about policies. Now, say, okay, fine. Now, what's then quite interesting as well is that unlike maybe 20 years ago, where everybody said, look, and economists often behave a bit like that, or there is an exact set of policies that you need to do. When you start looking at successful countries in the last few decades, then you see very diverse sets of policies. In China, very much state-led development. But Bangladesh is actually quite a success story, definitely halving extreme poverty, lots of good progress in indicators in development, but it definitely hasn't done it with state-led development. In fact, the state is pretty weak, and progress has been made by actually, relatively speaking, quite liberal economy, definitely in terms of the way the macroeconomy was managed. And on top of that, social sectors was often largely delivered by NGOs and totally different. It was definitely not state-led development. So if you then go into Africa as well, Ethiopia did it very differently from Ghana, although both have made substantial progress in the last 2-3 decades. Ghana definitely with much more liberal type of economy, a state that is not really taking the lead, while in Ethiopia they tried an experiment with state-led development, and quite successfully with high growth rates. So they did different things. The way they did it is different. In fact, if you look at the literature, if you look at countries, what have they done to be successful? It's actually a bit of a broader set of things than actually often people have suggested. It's not narrowly Washington consensus. It's actually a bit more pragmatic, a broader set that's possible. Now, don't make any mistake. It's not anything goes, economics still matters, economics constrains what you can do, you know, as indeed the former Prime Minister now in the UK, Liz Truss, has discovered. You know, you can't just do anything. You have to actually still within things, because markets will respond, the economy will respond in a particular way. In fact, what Liz Truss has done a very good favor to my cause, which is saying probably a good idea to have a good central bank, because they have to be there to clean up the mess. And if the central bank can't be independent enough, that's why we have the IMF. And in fact, of all these successful countries, they occasionally ended up using the IMF once in a while to clean up the mess if somehow the politics couldn't deliver the progress and keep on doing it. Indonesia, Bangladesh used, and Ghana as well, used the IMF very effectively when the politics can't do it anymore. Then they actually come and help to do exactly the role what an independent central bank should do, but then it becomes the IMF doing it. You can blame them for everything, but they actually do it. But anyway, it's a broad set of things. So where does it leave us? You have to ask yourself, not so much, oh, it's all history and institutions. No, I don't quite think so. It matters, and it constrains, again, history constrains, but it comes down to what the actors on the ground, those with power and influence, do at a particular moment in time. And that comes to the core of my analysis, that's saying, you know, success and failure is determined by those with power and influence, and I call these the elites, not just the finance minister or the central bank governor or the president or the prime minister, but actually the elites, those people with power and influence, those in the business community, those in government, those in the military often, those maybe even in civil society, public intellectuals, journalists that tell the stories, and so on. Now, you could have all kinds of societal deals amongst the elite, what I call an elite bargain. You could have one that actually is saying, let's actually have an elite bargain where the main purpose of what we do in the state is to steal from the people. This is probably what Mobutu Sese Seko did in the DRC, in Zaire, as it was called then. He basically took control of the state, and everything was about, if you're connected to the state, you can steal. You can steal from ordinary people, you can steal there, you know, for example, even today, you have 56 different tax authorities in the DRC. And I've been in businesses that I suddenly get a letter and say, oh, we suddenly thought that you haven't paid enough taxes. You need on Monday give us $1,000 and we'll come and pick it up personally. And you have to then put armed guards in front of it that are better armed than the guards that they bring, and then you won't have to pay. But basically, and I remember the letter, $1,000 exactly was exactly asked. Now, that's a kleptocracy. That's basically the state is there as an instrument of stealing. You have other states, and we see that in Africa. I'm thinking, for example, of Malawi, where the state fundamentally is, if you have power, you use it to deliver for those who put you in power. Pure clientelism. The people in business that put you in power, the people that delivered you the vote banks, those are connected in business to it, those politicians that keep you in power, you just need to give them enough rewards. So Malawi doesn't do any growth really of any meaningful way, but when you're in control, it's your time to eat. Well, of course, that was also what was suggested at some point, the slogan, it was actually not, but everybody thought after a while in the elections that Odinga in 2008 or 2007 was trying to fight, our time to eat, was then basically there. And it was the idea, if we get in control, it will be time for the Luos and those connected. That's their time to eat. So basically, you could have lots of elite bargains. So how do you get growth and development? Now, what the countries that have been successful have in common is that one way or another, they have an elite bargain where fundamentally those with power say, well, let's actually try to grow the economy. And let's actually do this. The minimal amount, you need to do that. And then, of course, things can still go wrong. So it has to be more than words. They have to make sure they somehow within the elite have a credible politics that people buy in and then don't simply go any moment in time for instability. And have to think of Pakistan, for example, where if you're not in control, you do everything you can to actually undermine anyone in power ever. So there's no credible politics around peace and stability. You have to also understand what your state can do. If your state has been built up purely to reward your friends with jobs, as Bangladesh had done after independence in 71, as many African countries have done after independence, and if you keep on doing that whenever you have power to reward your friends, you don't quite have a state in any way comparable with, for example, what I remember the Ethiopian state was like, was actually pretty meritocratic. Or indeed what China is, 2000 years of centralized state with meritocratic state exams to get in, very tough things that you get to get a job in the state. And then you have to have actually had 2000 years of centralized taxation and deliver it. So if you get a Malawian state, or indeed a Kenyan state or a Ghanaian state, you better don't use the state to deliver development, because that's not the way. You have to look for another model. And so finally, you have to have a way of correcting your errors. You can't do it all on ideology. You can't simply believe we're going to be self-sufficient in everything. We don't need trade. We're just going to do it, and then we'll build it up. And you need some form of learning, but that's a form of accountability. Either like in the Chinese model, where you can really discipline your civil servants if they don't deliver growth, or your party officials, or you have to maybe do it Ghanaian style. You have a political deal where if you're kicked out of power in the elections, you are kicked out in power in the elections, and you just have to wait until it's your turn again. And so you have, since the mid-1990s, a political elite that more or less buys into it. They go to the High Court for a few minutes, or maybe for a month, and then they give up, and that's it. Or indeed, as we had the transition of power in Kenya, now we're getting it. So that's what success is like. So where do we get in Nigeria? Well, I'm afraid we have not an elite bargain around growth and development. And I want to just make that clear and put my neck out, is basically the elite bargain in Nigeria is not built around trying to grow the economy, try to develop. Similarly, and getting the features there, let me explain in a moment the elite bargain. But even if you had it, this is not the way the state was built up. No, I've met, and there's actually some really able civil servants, but the underlying structures at the moment is not that it could lead development in a big way. You know, that's not, the structures are so undermined at the various levels as well. And of course, getting the accountability within that system, learning and correcting, you can't do it. If you choose ideology, as maybe the current president over the last 8 years has done, and it's all about ideas and language, but not ever checking, does anything ever work in what we try to do, then you're not going to get there. You need some accountability. You need a central bank that functions. I'm afraid you don't have a central bank that functions. You know, there is just no credible way of doing it. Because what is the underlying elite bargain? Well, to put it bluntly, you have the impression, you know, and had very good relations often with Abba Kyari, you know, he's not with us anymore, but, you know, he embodied a particular elite bargain, and it felt to me that they were spending probably 10 minutes a day trying to run the country, and the rest of their time trying to deliver for those people who actually put him in power. Because what is the elite bargain in Nigeria? In an extremely simple way, if you basically only sell to the world crude oil, well, that's basically the entire growth engine. Your economy is fundamentally selling crude oil to the world and then recycling that internally and in non-tradables, endless non-tradable stuff, and that's being done. So that's the economy, you know, and basically even the financial sector would be starved of resources if there was no crude oil sold to the world. You know, it's that resource that gets recycled as well in the economy. Yes, they do a bit more dynamic, but not too much, I would say. But what is the underlying elite bargain there is, you know, yeah, you have actually, unfortunately, probably not that much oil. And in fact, you have every day, it seems less, but that's another story. But you don't have that much oil. And, you know, in a good year, this is not the current diversions and so on, but in a good year, you may have about $500 per capita in the country. $500 per capita. That's not really to build wealth on. At best, you know, that's very little. Of course, that's if you were to divide it amongst the whole population. But if you were to divide it amongst 100,000 people rather than 200 million people, they each have $1 million per capita per year. Actually, I think that's fundamentally, on average, the elite bargain of Nigeria. 100,000 people make a really good living. Okay, not everybody gets $1 million. Some get 50,000 and some get $1 billion. But that's basically then the inequality within it of how much they get. But that's basically what the game in town is. And everything is around moving that money around and capturing a bit more and less, a pure zero-sum game in the economy. And of course, you know, a total underperformance. How can we change this? Well, we need somehow to move to an elite bargain in Nigeria that fundamentally wants growth, That does mean not just recycling and lining your pockets and only, you know, sending your kids to eat and buying houses in London, but actually investing in the country, using these resources to invest in your country, meaning in the short run, maybe not being able to line your pockets, but you need to have a coalition of the business elite, political elite, maybe senior civil servants, probably influential voices, to actually become committed to development. And I think that's where I will end now. Nigeria seems to be at this moment for choice. It hasn't done this probably all the way to the early 2000s. And even then, I don't think it drove it to its full consequence, even though it was managing the economy a bit better. But actually, I would say for decades now, the Nigerian economy has been grown for a zero-sum, been managed around a zero-sum game that actually lead us to, by 2030, a Nigerianization of poverty, and it will be #1 in the world in poverty. That will be the one achievement. Or the other choices, that we move towards a real gamble amongst the elite, to actually saying, look, we'll need to try to get something else. We'll need to be able to gamble. And why is the gamble? Because some in the elite will lose their position. There's no doubt that some will lose their position. But actually, this is just a road to nowhere. It will feed insecurity, it will feed marginalization, it will feed further poverty. It's just and something that has really dark future unless you do it. That gamble needs to be taken. There needs to be a progress around it. And yeah, and then we'll have to see where it gets. But that's the choice we're getting at. I don't know how we'll get to it at this stage, but I'm not so hopeful that in the choice between the current two main contenders for the presidency will have any of that kind of vision, a credible way to actually get to that. So that's I think, where we are, and I'm very happy to debate further now. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction. And, you know, it's already raised a lot of questions. But before we get into how to achieve that consensus and get the elite to gamble for development, I thought maybe we just start from the basics of ensuring that we're speaking the same language. You know, so how do you look at development, you know, in this context, right? Because we've seen in Nigeria where for about a decade, you know, we did about 7% GDP growth, you know, but it was jobless growth, poverty worsened, unemployment worsened, etc. So for the average Nigerian who's out there, who wants to see if development is happening, what are some of the indicators in the context in which you use the word, you know, that this average Nigerian should be looking at?
Exactly. So that's a really good one. So given that you export oil and you're at the mercy of international prices, growth is not very helpful unless we were able to strip it out of the oil component. But given that so much of the economy is recycling of oil, it's not that helpful. So we'll have to start looking at something else. So what I would love to see is, you know, for example, the share of exports that is not crude oil. You know, I would love
non-oil exports. Yeah.
Yes. I would love to buy something in the UK or anywhere else in the world. I have never seen it in a shop. I've never seen Made in Nigeria anywhere in a shop. I would love to buy anything. I don't care what it is. I'll buy it. I remember my joy when I for the first time in a garment factory, in a garment shop, sorry, in the UK, I found Made in Ethiopia. I bought a t-shirt, totally wrong size, never worn it, but I bought it because I said, okay, something is happening. I'm not saying it should be garments. Probably not, but something. I would like to buy something. So it's things like basically the non-oil part of GDP sectors that are actually doing it, preferably selling something to the world, tradable goods, you know, things that potentially could be sold to the world or properly competed with relative to imports, not behind all the trade barriers that it usually is in the Nigerian context. So something that actually say, wow, I could internationally buy it. It could compete with a commodity. I would similarly look, of course, in growth in agriculture because so many people are dependent on it and it's so underperforming. Although I know that it actually is so dependent on, you know, terrible macroeconomic policies, you know, and for that exchange rate, you know, so much food is being imported because there's just no way that domestic food production can really be competitive at that exchange rate. So there's things like that. So I want to look in the economy in anything that doesn't make me smell of crude oil, you know, that basically is something different. And then in development, that's where the litmus test will be, where the real test will be. I want to look at extreme poverty because that's where you top on. I want to look at that very carefully, what's happening. And then, you're alluding to it. It's broader development indicators. In the book, I always talk about growth and development because, inclusive development, people misunderstand after a bit. Inclusive growth, misunderstand a bit. It feels technical as well. But growth and development, because I want to look at broader development indicators. Your health indicators are dreadful. Your learning indicators are dreadful. I mean, actually, there's enough there that's bad that to do it. I always worry a bit about employment, if I'm really honest, because in an economy where so much is self-employment, it's so hard to measure properly what is really unemployment here, because a lot of it is people also queuing for a formal sector job and so on. So it reflects distortion as well. So, of course, employment is an issue, but it's not the easiest indicator to really interpret. I would go to the material well-being indicators of poverty. And then, of course, it comes to it, is that if in all these countries that I look at, people say, where is inequality? Well, actually, none of these countries could achieve sustaining growth. Even the IMF tells that these days, unless they're dealt with the distributional consequences. Inequality becomes almost something that is what you require to keep growth going. At this stage in Nigeria, I wanted to just start. I want some proper growth starting, working on the lower end of the development indicators and doing it. So please don't type past me. I'm a microeconomist. I will never really just look at GDP as this sacrosanct kind of thing, not least in an economy like yours, where it's not informative of the transformation that's happening.
No, and I agree with you. I mean, I believe that those are the indicators we look at, non-oil exports, etc. There are a few I could have pointed you to, so to some African food market, where you would get some African Nigerian-made food items, but then you need to have the skills to prepare them. So I'm not going to bother with that. And even the coffee, coffee that comes from the Mambila Plateau is unfortunately branded Cameroonian coffee. So you drink it, it's coming from Nigeria, but you really don't know it's Nigerian. But like I said at the beginning, let me pull in Dr. Sam Amadi, to make some of his interventions. He was until recently chairman of Nigeria Electricity Regulatory Commission. Before then, he was a special advisor to the president of the Nigeria Senate and had worked in various scholarly roles, both in Abuja and Lagos, currently director at the Abuja School of Social and Political Thought. One of his experiences that I always like to reference is that he was an advocate in the defense of Ken Saro-Wiwa, when he was tried and murdered by the Nigerian government. A fellow at the Harvard Law School. Sam Amadi, you're welcome.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Thank you, Stefan.
Thank you.
Yeah, Sam, if you can make your quick intervention and then we can continue with the conversation.
Well, thank you. I think first, let me thank you, Patrick, for the book. I buy a lot of books when they come out, especially economists like him, but I don't know why I didn't buy this before. I saw it with you, and I couldn't finish before you took it back from me. But let me say that it's probably closer to my view about economic development in Nigeria. 2 weeks ago, I think, or thereabout, I wrote a piece on a new economics for 2023, this day back page. And the point I was trying to make is looking at the manifesto of economic plan of the leading candidates, they seem to all talk about private sector of the economy and all that, and are presuming that everything is okay with what I call social order. And that's the idea that maybe the first thing to fix or to think about is the way the country or the state power, state relationship between state and citizens is defined, which then maybe stipulates and determine some of the policies, whether the specific policies. And so I see his book, this book, as really doing the job for me at two levels. One, the big debates, whether you look at English, like I said, you look at Asemogo, you look at the argument around institutions, or geography, or export orientation, market economy. I think he brings them all together in the sense of his development bargain. And this is the way I look at it. It answers, to an extent, the question of the most structuralist and the dependence theories around whether our problem relates to the historical aspect of our being embedded unequally in the global market economy. And then he answers the question of those, the neoliberals, who probably looking at the policies we select in terms of whether they're market friendly, whether they are reasonable macroeconomic policy. So by looking at development bargain as a construction around the motivation of the economic policymakers themselves, around their historical determinism, if anything like that exists, around whether the whole focus, objective of government is to deal with democratic citizenship, to improve the well-being of the people. I think that construct helps us, converge some of these salient points from these various schools. I think that's the great thing about the point he made. Secondly, I like the fact that he locates countries, Asia, Africa, within a spectrum. Some are developing, evolving. They may not be a classic case of success like the East Asia. But if you come down home, we see transformations. Some of them didn't require too much disruption, not a revolution, maybe didn't come out from war, didn't have this cataclysmic, build up. But somehow we see politicians, policymakers, leaders skillfully creating, nudging people towards a new understanding and undertaking in how they run their country. So it gives hope for people like us in Africa or Nigeria who probably are not anticipating a revolutionary moment, that we can also construct this bargain incrementally by kind of nudging policymakers towards understanding and patterning their own incentive and their greater well-being in creating a bargain. Again, if you look at he borrowed exactly from the work that both wing guests and even the theory around state formation. How does the state emerge from banditry to some kind of self-serving but other regarding engagement? So we create a state, we limit our individual opportunism, and out of it emerges this altruism that's essentially concrete expression of our long-term interest. So from that concept, it becomes to make sense how we can also, as well, in Nigeria, move our people towards this bargain for development. Now, let me make this point quickly. I met with one of the leading presidential aspirants fortuitously last night, and I tried to talk to him around, can we construct campaign to across the socioeconomic ethnic divide around a sense in which there could be a buy-in for everybody. There could be a win-win for everybody. Can you have a narrative that will make everybody combatants see how this construction of economic bargain is a better option for everybody? And I think for Nigeria going forward, it calls for three things. One is the power of narratives. Can the media, social media, influencers begin to shape a narrative around how we can gain by committing to basic, simple proportions like life and property, protection of life and property, rule of law, including economic and social rights, functional education that enhances individual and society, science and technology that will drive a social advancement, and a fair and just reward system that leads back to productivity. So if we can have that narrative around these 5 minimum safe, normatively non-controversial, or ideologically not divisive, we can begin to move towards this development bargain. And the second would now be, if we can then create a sense in which a focus on development and growth becomes a political winner. And then the party leaders themselves begin to see the attraction to bend or brand themselves as development enthusiasts. Then we might be getting there. So that would be a second one. And the third one would then be that maybe if we stay on market reform as we're doing it, maybe in a way the market structure becomes difficult for politicians to manage from the old perspective of individual self-interest. And so it's possible that deepening market reform, accelerating changes in the marketplace, economic development, private sector-led development, entrepreneurs thinking more about merit-based, thinking about production, thinking and less about rents, can also be a catalyst and an event that tilts politicians in their thinking, mentality, and their pursuit towards the market. So I would like to end for now to say, I think the great thing about the way you have created this straitjacket now, or a new straitjacket for development, is that it allows people to come from different perspectives. It allows societies to move into the development bargain from at different stages of state formation. It allows both structuralists, dependence theories, free marketers to have something that is not really, that does not exclude them. So no country will have the fatalism that it cannot develop or focus on growth. It can always find a lever somewhere to enter into that trajectory. Like if they deepen it and smartly manage it, they could find themselves in a vicious circle or in now in an automatic accelerator towards becoming like Korea, becoming like Japan, or at least becoming like about Rwanda, or even becoming like Thailand. So I think that's really the great thing about this. And totally agree with you that we can't talk about economic policy making without really factoring both the structure that condition policymakers and the motivation. And that builds back to the cultural structural crisis of the state. So if the state creates the incentive to predate, then in spite of the fancy slides and the figures and brains from Harvard, Oxford, and Cambridge, you might discover that really, like people say, you wash your hand to crack the kernel of the palm tree, of the palm nut, just to give it to fowls or hook, as you say in Igbo, to eat it again. So thank you for a great book. I think for me, it looks like somebody is thinking like me. And finally, it tells us that really the trick is not economics. It's maybe the old political economy. We don't have to focus on academic economists like you, even though it's a respectable profession. We will now see that we need to think more around what in the past, in the days of Adam Smith, they called political economy. No wonder there was no economics department in Adam Smith days. Where they were teaching morals, teaching jurisprudence.
I think we may have lost Sam, but he was coming to the end of his intervention. So let me thank him for that. And I think it's a good segue. Thank you, Sam. And I'll invite Stefan to maybe make one or two comments or respond to what he heard from Sam. But it's interesting that he mentioned he was with one of the presidential candidates last night and trying to see if we can build a different narrative that cuts across different socioeconomic strata. And that leads to my question, which is, Nigeria has an elite consensus. It's just that consensus is to take care of the elites, right? And since we know that rams do not vote for Salah, neither do turkeys vote for Thanksgiving, what are those conditions that will get the elites to change the status quo beyond Sam going to preach to a candidate who's just one of the many veto players in the game? So what are some of the things that got a Deng Xiaoping or a Boris Yeltsin to move towards openness as a route to development when they could have held on to what always worked for them? And do we see some of those conditions beginning to emerge in Nigeria that proves to us that we can get the elites to gamble on development? Stefan. You're muted, you're muted.
Should be okay now. Apologies. Yes. No, thank you, Sam, for these very insightful comments. And I really liked them. There were some, yes. And I think your steps towards translating these in terms of, how do you talk to a politician around it, I very much appreciate. And I will come back to that in a moment. Let me pick up, Patrick, your point here on, when do elites choose? Now, it's a very striking thing. So if you mentioned China, Deng Xiaoping, we forget somehow that China was imploding in the 1970s. The Cultural Revolution had totally destabilized the underlying institutional structures. And Mao's death, of course, followed by the Gang of Four, trying to get ideology in the Cultural Revolution reinvigorated and totally getting ideology as the base of all economic policy. So, this was a party that was risking to lose power. So that's a helpful idea. They acted partly because they were losing legitimacy to the population, and in that process, they would lose power. I remember, I'm old enough to remember people talking about the demise of China potentially in that period. So you do get somehow Deng Xiaoping coming into it and saying, well, we'll need to do it differently here, pragmatically. It doesn't matter whether the cat is white or black as long as it catches mice, kind of economic policies. Pragmatically, I need to do something else. Ideology is out, pragmatism rules. Now, that's an enormous step for that political elite at the time. And he clearly needed to build a coalition. I'm not saying he was the only one. Several people needed to somehow capture the party and convince the elite, which is not a small thing. The party works more or less as a democracy then, as it is to some extent now. So it means a small percentage of the population can actually vote, but you need to convince quite a lot of people that you actually need that kind of thing. So that's a helpful thing. So they chose because they needed legitimacy. I'm simply, and I don't mean this disrespectfully, if I look at, say, Paul Kagame or Meles Zenawi in Rwanda or in Ethiopia, they needed also to look for legitimacy. They couldn't get it from the way they got to power. They couldn't get it, as we had it, of course, important narratives being built in Rwanda around ethnicity and not. But, they still represented a very small group of people that came to power. So they needed to have broadened the legitimacy, and economics is then, or development is then a good thing. Meles Zenawi definitely needed legitimacy after having lost the election in 2005 and the whole instability that followed. That's actually a choice. I can't get it politically, the bargain together. I'll need to do it developmentally and economically. That was very much, what's getting the legitimacy of their position in the state as well. So you get it there. I think Ghana is interesting because there was actually more. We needed to somehow do politics differently because before Jerry Rawlings, politics basically didn't get us anywhere. The way we were doing the state and the whole thing. Jerry Rawlings came to power, but the political elite, of course, didn't want military dictatorship forever. They needed to buy into a constitution that kind of was restrictive, but worked for Ghana, which is basically meaning you have to have multi-regional, multi-ethnic parties. And that's not quite the way politics was done before. So actually, but the elites, the political elite seems to have bought into it. So it's somehow there, it's a recognition we can't keep on going. It's not quite, we can't keep on doing it in the old ways. We need to buy into this restricted set of things. What I'm trying to suggest, in each place it is slightly differently, but it is a moment of crisis or a recognition that it can't continue as it is. In Indonesia, it was very much a combination of all these things. We have no legitimacy, we're coming out of conflict. In Bangladesh, it was, we screwed up independence the first 10 years. We can't keep on doing it like this, 1971 till the early 80s. In various ways. Come to Nigeria, crisis is actually a good moment to do this. I'm actually talking to you from Mauritius, tiny place, maybe irrelevant, but it's really interesting that everybody who was writing about about Mauritius in that period, in the early period before and after independence, was saying nothing would come to it. Nobel Prize winner James Mead wrote that there was nothing going to ever happen in Mauritius. This was structurally, the colonialism was awful, the structure of the economy, the multi-ethnicity, the structure of the economy because of sugar, nothing will ever happen to it. They actually hit a massive crisis early on after independence, after 68, 1970s. By 1979, the second oil crisis, there were nothing there. They actually themselves decided to reform. They got an elite consensus between the old elites and those who were actually delivering the votes, the Indian community, and then the old French colonial structures. They did structural adjustment early on, 1983, 84, it was over. 1987, they were growing 11% per year. And they haven't looked back. They have transformed this economy, now a high income economy, from a lower middle income, very poor lower middle income status. This is choices you make. And that comes back to the agency. But it gets pushed from really bad moments, I think, where you actually start reflecting, we can't do it. I think Nigeria is hitting that moment. You know, it's not delivered. It's concerned about security. It's concerned about its youth. I was in a close meeting with some very senior people. Let me not classify where they were from, but they were very senior people in Abuja. And when one of the people said, the only way I see us ever changing is through a revolution. You know, there is an alternative to revolution in Nigeria. I think that is elite consensus that actually are going to do it differently. So let me then, that's the thing, let me quickly pick up on Sam's points, and 2 points that I really liked, because I recognize them what other countries did. And the first one is to actually finding a way to turning into outcome-based politics as a winning strategy. Okay, now that is partly driven by an elite consensus. You need your journalists on site, you need your people that are monitoring, your civil society that monitors it. I actually would say this is what happened in Ghana, is that since the 1990s, more and more, and we have political science evidence on it, that more and more MPs are elected or not elected, dependent on whether they delivered for their constituency. There's a way to interpreting what's been happening in Kenya. Ruto won for the first time an election based on outcome-based politics. You know, David Ndii, the advisor to the president, it was entirely focused on we're going to deliver for small-scale farmers, and very concrete and sensible. Actually, it's probably one of the things that political scientists said why Ruto won against the ethnic-based bloc voting that everybody thought would deliver it to Odinga. So that actually you need to do it, but you need civil society and your journalists and your narrative builders to work on that. And that comes back to this other point that I want to pick up from Sam. Absolutely right. It's about narrative building. And I think that's where politicians come into it. Beginning to do, you know, Lee Kuan Yew was not just, oh, I just had a beautiful story and everybody's going to follow it. He was a great narrative building for Singapore. That's actually to the core of it. Politicians, they are their most effective when they're not trying to act as commander-in-chiefs, but when they try to act as communicators-in-chief, that actually try to convince first the elite that this is a sensible thing, that to protect their positions, and then also the broader public that to take them along. That was crucially important, even in Suharto's time in Indonesia. Definitely in Deng Xiaoping was crucially important. You know, all the sayings to try to explain, that's communication. That was pure part of it, and to actually build that. So you need to be able to do it. I think as again, elite players can do it because it needs credible politics that people don't all the time try to undermine it quickly and cheaply. You know, and that's when I'm thinking of Pakistan politics, that has become so populist, so easily undermined potential narratives of change that Pakistan is stuck there. That actually, you know, well, in Indian politics, with all its problems, all political parties these days accept that delivering on growth is a good way to judge your progress, you know? And the interesting thing in India was, in the early 1990s, only Congress and Janata Dal was talking about progress in growth. By the end of the 90s, the BJP, the current party in power, had dropped other kind of narratives and started having a narrative about progress on growth as something as crucially important in doing it. We forget sometimes in Western countries that we didn't always have it. Probably in the 1930s in the US with the New Deal, probably after the First World War and after the Second World War in most Western countries, delivering for people growth and development, that's only when it came. It's very recent. I think Nigeria needs to get that and find the language around it, but in an honest way and in a kind of willingness to be held to account sort of way around this. I think that's what I appreciate Sam's comments there.
Thank you, Stefan. So here is what I struggled a lot with, as I read the book. I understand the idea of a conflict situation or a crisis, triggering this, need for the elite to either gamble on development to return onto power or etc. We saw that in China and some of the other countries, mentioned in the book. And I wonder if there are any other circumstances that could push the elite to gamble on development. Given that if you take Nigeria, for instance, we've been tethering on the edge. I think it's, we've been dancing on the brink for a bit. Even as the situation is today, where we've got a government that's leaving office and has not delivered as much, we still do not find that the elites are threatened in any way that they're going to lose their powers, because we don't have parties that are built on ideology. We've just got one party, one political party, and it's the elite party of Nigeria. And they can move between different vehicles, but it's the same party, right? We've got a pure weaponization of poverty. So there is an absence of a middle class that can force the elite to do anything. The rest of us are too poor to demonstrate for more than 24 hours or do anything else. So if we're not going to have a crisis, i.e. a war, etc., what else could incentivize these elites to move in that direction? I understand the idea of preaching to them, talking to them, but I don't expect that it's going to happen. So what else have you seen in your work in some other countries that got the elite to move in a particular direction?
So the way I look at it, and that's a little bit conceptually, is like, this is about, behaviors in the elite are such because they expect everybody else to behave in a particular way. Okay, so why does it feel so stuck? Because what's the incentive of a senior civil servant to act differently? We only get sacked if they start speaking out against their minister. What's the incentive of a business person to to repeat, like a banker, to repeat what I say, that I think the governor of the central bank has screwed up the economy? If they say it, they will be punished, they will be finding way to making it very difficult for that bank. You do know that somehow, if I only act, I can't really do it. So, but I do think it's situations like that were present in other contexts as well. Okay, so it is a bit of that kind of element of, when I look at it, I'm surprised how many countries have moved towards it. Some did it out of crisis. Some didn't do it purely out of a crisis, but actually some kind of enlightened self-interest. And I think that enlightened self-interest, the cake can actually grow. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. We can actually all be a bit better off. I would say, for example, seem to have led in the 1990s to actually something that wasn't continued, but in Uganda to actually quite a lot of change quite quickly, where actually suddenly you've got an economy to grow and actually got quite a lot of alignment. So I think it can happen. Why I'm being unhelpful to you is that I don't have the clear predictor, nor the kind of belief that it's the revolutionary thing, the kind of massive crisis that I want to recommend. I'm cautious about these massive crises, and I can only talk to the elite and say, look, you better have your own agency there, in the sense you need to act, you need to have your act and behavior, and you need to keep on to actually saying, look, I'm going to try to act something differently. Because Why Nations Fail came out around the Arab Spring. And the authors went around the Middle East saying, this is your moment, this is all going to be all for the better. We know when it is in these extreme things, it can go all kinds of ways. So I'm with Sam that I actually try to suggest it can be gradual. You can get, for example, a central bank to get run better. You can get a Ministry of Finance to become prudent. You can actually get an accountability part. For example, you can get certain bits of procurement. There is actually hope that the National Petroleum Corporation one day will be run sanely and sensibly. That actually can be possible. We see that in other countries, that bits and pieces can be taken control of by actually, you know, bits of pressure, an elite alignment around, look, we can't do that extreme form anymore because everybody loses. You know, you can do that. But can I tell you how exactly Nigeria? No, you're a complicated place. You know, you are, you know, this may be a reason why you come very late in that kind of chain of countries where they get together. But you are the last of the large countries in the developing world that actually hasn't even shown ever a phase of more than 5-6 years of actually going beyond, you know, some kind of very modest or no growth. So, you know, you're one of the last ones. So I kind of hopeful that, you know, if you can do a string of 4 years, 6 years, 8 years together, and don't let it peter out, but find a transition, you know, the bit of the Obasanjo growth years or the 1960s growth rates, you know, spin it together, get somehow a bit of belief in the elite that actually some of these things can actually last, find a way of then transiting power in the complicated politics that you have. I would actually say yes. So bits at a time, you know, don't expect a Kagame style. You know, that's not your political system. Your political system couldn't survive a Kagame style. You know, Rwanda is a tiny place, okay? We see what happened in Ethiopia, forgets to do the political deals between the different nationalities, which is essentially what the TPLF forgot to do. They thought they could keep power, they could get an elite bargain and only focus on development of the economy, and they will keep control. That doesn't work. You know, other groups will need to have a bit of their time to eat. So you need to find a way of accommodating. Nigeria will have to accommodate, but you know, you'll need to. So I'm actually quite hopeful. 4 years of sensible stuff in the economic things, you'll see the economy growing. I mean, actually, it is not so hard to get the economy of Nigeria to grow. Actually, I don't think so. You know, just some basic sensible stuff, more than 10 minutes a day focusing on the economy by the leadership would probably get you there. You know, a day a week, 2 days a week focusing on it will make a lot of progress, and not all the time having to do your backroom deals and keeping your whole thing being done. So I'm optimistic, but can I tell you exactly, you know, the 3 steps that you will do? Well, you know, there's about 10 places where it may happen. And maybe that's another way to look at it. There's probably 10 bits that you could probably identify. We probably agree quickly. The central bank is one, the Ministry of Finance would be another one, probably National Petroleum Corporation. There's probably a few other places that you say, actually, if we can get things a bit stable there, we can actually start building something. All 10 may not happen. 3, 4, 5 of them, if they begin to happen, we'll actually see change, and we'll actually see the beginning of an unraveling, because we'll get actually newer groups to emerge with some growth, with some progress, and more elite interest to actually have more of that same, and to actually see the growth happening. So by the way, I have a lot of trust in the business community in that sense, is that they are a little bit, you know, one of our events, someone spoke up and said, we're suffering from Stockholm syndrome. We've been kept hostage by this political class, and we totally understand now the whole thing. We don't realize that we actually kept hostage. We need to break out, you know, we have to leave the hostage situation and actually walk away and actually start doing something else. And actually, fundamentally, maybe things will begin to change.
Thank you, thank you. And I want to bring Sam, you know, back in. Sam and I had this interesting development discourse similar to this chat at the heart of the COVID pandemic. And it was centered around incoherence. And I know he's been working on this incoherence theory for a while. So I'd invite Sam to speak about it and how it relates to achieving consensus, elite consensus around development. Because if the substructure is completely incoherent, then building on top of it may not lead to the result we're looking for. So Sam, if you could speak a little bit to that.
Okay, thank you once again. And I think my idea of incoherence is that, look, if you look at the Nigerian constitution, we struggle, there's a debate around structuring. The constitution is not just a legal instrument. It is also like a company. It's also a mission statement. It's also a lead strategy document. So it's also a narrative about the people, what they see themselves doing together as a people. So the US Constitution says, we the people of the US, this is our sense of identity, also our sense of mission, and how we want to organize ourselves. So in a sense, it constructs a bargain, a compact between the people. Yes, some people argued blacks were not there, property to white men did all this draft, but essentially, when they sell this document through narrative, it becomes the American dream. And so, question unconsciously, we sign up to it. We, those who became immigrants later day America, sign up to it. Now, if its legitimacy is weakened, then it becomes, we start pointing at incoherence. Okay, well, fine, you can't talk about all of us being equal citizens when X, Y, Z. So if that incoherence, if that contradiction becomes big, it defeats the power or the efficacy of the constitutional document to be a strategic document, a visionary document, a document that mobilizes people and in a coherent, consistent manner. So the Nigerian Constitution is incoherent because if you look at it carefully, you wonder, are we trying to create an egalitarian democratic state? Are we trying to create an autocratic feudal state? So that's, for me, is a basic matter of incoherence. It can lead to constitutional legal problems in terms of implementation, but it first leads to a conceptual crisis of what are we and what are we trying to become. Now, if you go back to the development bargain, at a point, Stephen talked about informal and formal and informal. So there are norms, there are procedures, behaviors, social compacts that leaders generate and also follow in their leadership. And the people see, for example, in Nigeria today, the public service is seen as a place for gaming. So you get there, you appoint your own people. If you are made a DG, there's an assumption, a tacit compact, that you're going to staff that place with people for your own place. If you fail to do so, they'll take you on and say, well, when you were chairman of NERC, like own case, how many of people in our village they put in there? Now, nobody looks at the role of that as a regulator, what it's supposed to be. You are supposed to set rules to govern market participants. They see it as, this is our own, but people say, I was sent there to represent my community. And therefore, the outcome should be the offices, the contract, the employment that you give to your people. So when I see how this come together, what Stephen is asking political elites to do is to form a coherent narrative focused around development and growth. And then align informal norms, behaviors, processes, and actions to align with that vision and idea. Right? If you do that, you are crafting a coherent narrative about who we are, about what we do. And that narrative is reinforced by everyday performance of people in authority, both in formal role and informal. Things like whether you have 20 police officers following you, whether you're going to have motorcade of, let's say, 100 cars or 10 cars, or whether you just carry a jacket and carry a bag and jump into your car and drive to a meeting, all those things now reinforces that narrative, that coherence. So I think that this book further underlies the notion of incoherence, but approaches it from the perspective of a democratic agenda, a development agenda, in terms of basic things that state now focuses, allocates resources towards. But my own narrative of incoherence situated more within the sort of concept of ideation. Who are we? What's this citizenship? What's Nigeria all about? Who's a Nigerian citizen? And that citizenship fits into who votes, how we vote, how we allocate resources, and how we manage the resources and the functions of government. And what is common to both of them is coherence and consistency, that leaders are actually driving towards an agenda. And that's one overarching strategic notion or notions that define how we use resources, that define the policies we make, whether with taxation, whether with managing inflation, whether macroeconomic policy, and so on and so forth. So I think that I borrow his idea about the development bargain to illustrate and to concretize this idea of coherence, that leaders are building, have a coherent project. You're not saying we want to create a modern economy. At the same time, everything you do is neo-feudal, prerogative, builds up back to a sense of an entitlement that's not based on production, not based on work, and not based on nurturing the common good through prosperity and through inclusion, social justice. So I think I see a nexus on the two concepts, and I think that
excellent. Thank you, Sam, and I'll come to Stefan in a minute. But just to remind our audience, if you've got any question, please raise up your hand or type it in the chat room, and we'll elevate you to ask your question. But Stefan, how do you respond to Sam's comments on incoherence, and is there a fundamental need? So if you look at the Nigerian constitution, it seems to be incoherent. Must we change the constitution before we can achieve consensus? Or can this be done even in a system that seems to be fractured? How does this work within a complex, multi-ethnic, multi-faith, society where, these issues could make it a bit more complicated and complex than some of these other countries, both in Africa and elsewhere? Stefan.
So I think, if I understood Sam's way of reasoning correctly, and he can correct me if not, but the way I look at it is that when it comes to the actions and behaviors around development and growth, it's first and foremost within the realm of the informal consistency and coherence. Now, there's an advantage to it, because it's not about a legal obligation to do something and so on. It actually is, and it can help to overcome some of these contradictions that we see in so many countries, which is actually that constitutions and law is inconsistent with actions and behavior. And law, and I will not be, but well, I can be criticized on it with lawyers in the room, but I think law is often at its most powerful when it captures the way actions and behaviors are evolving. Okay, so that it actually, the actions and behaviors, or the willingness to act and behave, so it brings then final consistency in the action and coherence in the actions and behaviors. But the coherence has to be there first. The law can't compel. And I think a lot to do with this, with the way the state works in Nigeria, is that basically the law is, in fact, we see that in lots of countries. In fact, laws and the legal setup is not that different often between successful and unsuccessful countries. It's just in the way the actions and behaviors are fundamentally different, whether it's on corruption or related matters. It's there. So no, I think there is because one of the things that can bring coherence is actually a focus on progress and growth and development. Because even though we could argue, what exactly should be captured, we could probably agree quite quickly, both in what the places and the territory, so to speak, as we were talking about earlier, where change needs to happen, but also the outcomes that we would need to observe to see whether it is actually successful. Just as, if you think in the Chinese, go back to China, is that they both had a clear sense what the nature of the reforms had to be in the way they governed their economy and their party and their progress, as well as how they would measure it to actually judge whether it was successful or not. So, and growth and development gives you that opportunity. You can measure the outcomes. We can also, within our own contextual knowledge, identify quite quickly where some of the places would be where change needs to happen, and where at least the beginning of commitment to change has to be, and then gradually trying to see whether we can't get the norms and behaviors and the rules of the game, say within the National Petroleum Corporation, to begin to actually change, irrespective of the law, but actually getting the actions and behaviors to start changing. So maybe that's not that inconsistent, but I think it's important, because what Sam is referring to as the coherence is what I refer to also in some sense in the book about learning and accountability. You know, you need to have a way of judging, does it all work together? You know, is it actually making the progress we want? It doesn't have to be perfection, but it has to be a willingness to improve.
Okay, so another question is democracy a precondition for this elite consensus towards development? Especially if you look at countries like, say, China or even Rwanda or Singapore. And that question gains a bit more relevance in Africa today, given what we've noticed in the last 2 years. In the decade leading up to 2021, average coup attempts in Africa, less than 1. In the last 2 months, we've seen about 6 successful coups, a few more attempts. We thought we were immune to coups, but these guys have held on to power, and the West is not breathing down their necks to relinquish power. So there's a fear of a neighborhood effect, especially as democratically elected governments fail to deliver, the democracy dividend. A number of scholars and analysts begin to argue that maybe a benevolent dictator, becomes a better approach to these developments that we seek. For the record, I completely disagree, but I wonder what your views are on that, especially as someone who studied this around the world.
So there's a couple of things. So first of all, I think given the coups and the military and so on coming in, I think we better remember that in most countries in the world, the military is part of the elite. Okay, so the elite bargain doesn't look pretty in many countries, even if it's for development. They want their stake. In India, they still have the nicest pieces of land in the city centers and beautiful services. They matter in Pakistan, they matter in Bangladesh. There is some accommodation because, you give them a certain power, including a monopoly of violence in your country. You can't forget that actually they play a role, so they actually are a powerful position as well. So the fact that they sometimes make noise and think this is our time, because, this is a reflection of both elite bargains that are not particularly stable and at the same time happening. Now, on the more fundamental question, as in most things these days, I'm pretty pragmatic, okay? And I like to look at the evidence. And if I look at the evidence around takeoff and basic progress in economies, and for the moment, let's use it as growth progress, but we can look at other things as well, and although I know the evidence of growth, is that on average, in these periods of takeoff, democracies and autocracies perform very similarly, which could be similarly good or similarly bad. And so the one difference, though, is that the difference between the worst performing democracies and the best performing democracies is not that big. Between the worst performing autocracies and the best performing autocracies, it's really huge. More specifically, some of the best successful stories are what you may well refer to as benevolent dictators. But some of the worst performers are terrible dictators that actually screw up the whole population, the whole country. So the spread is large. Now, you have to tell me, do I want to myself, and I'm probably then share the view of you, in a veil of ignorance, do I want to take that gamble that actually the dictator I'll get is the benevolent one or not, or the terrible one? I don't want to. Then I'd rather have my democracy. But I have to be honest that on average, they don't perform that much better. Now, and another answer to that is, there are contexts where clearly the autocracies have worked, often where the state was stronger historically as well. There's historical studies even that would say Rwanda is an interesting case because the pre-colonial borders and the current borders are very similar. Ethiopia, similarly, of course, was never colonized beyond 6 years under the Italians. So you get somehow a history of a state that goes longer. China, the long history of the state matters here as well. So that potentially there is a chance that it can work because the state is also stronger. If you have a weak state, an autocracy is unlikely to actually deliver anything, a form of accountability, because you need probably democracy or some similar process to get some external accountability, because otherwise, the state gets captured by your dictators or whoever controls it. And then there is very little checks and balances to get it to function, and not much happens. So democracy in many countries, and it's not surprising that in Ghana, you needed to return to democracy to get the growth going again. You got the stabilization and the rollings, but you got the growth going again later because you got somehow the stability, it worked for the society and so on. Kenya, you got the growth back probably after 2000 with a better regime. And especially, in fact, in recent times, I'm quite hopeful for Kenya as well, that it actually can do it. So, I'm tempted to say, given the complexity of Nigeria, I don't think you want to wish for your benevolent dictator, because dare I say you've tried it and it didn't quite work on average. You had some terrible examples, you had some decent examples. It doesn't work on average. I don't think you want to wish for it. You better get your democracy to work, because in a very complex situation, you need to find ways of accommodating different interests, and you can't have one group to totally capture all the interests. So you're doing it, yeah. And it will not be easy. It's a complex place. Your federal structure is a complex, it gives a complexity. Is it federal enough? Some people would say not. In other places, other people would say it's too much. You'll need to find ways of resolving it. But I think, democracy, it will be in the context specific, get it to work. By the way, Malawi is a democracy, it doesn't deliver anything. And to simply say, oh, that's enough, that's a sufficient condition, no way it is. It's neither a necessary nor sufficient condition. But do I like it? Yes, I do.
Excellent. Now, if we know that we do not have the middle class, that can put pressure on the need to do what doesn't come natural to them, which is to change the status quo and make a gamble on development. Is it fair to think that we then need maybe external support? Yeah, and by external actors here, I'm looking at international development agencies, governments, etc., providing certain conditionalities upon which governments access capital markets or international aid. And if you do not meet certain benchmarks on development, then you're shut out. This is almost like building on Damisa Moyo's arguments and so on. What's the real argument against this position?
Well, okay, so I think just leaving it to international capital markets is not going to change the elite. It's the easy thing. And if I put it in a simplistic way, Dambisa's argument, it seems to be simply coming down to it. Let just the markets do it, and we'll deliver it for Africa and so on. It ignores the problem of fundamentally an elite bargain that wants to use these things well or not. Okay, so it's not resolving that. International agencies and so on, I am very reluctant to actually go that route. Okay, so even though I've worked in international aid structures, the international aid structures work best, whether it's the World Bank, the IMF, or others, or the DFID for the world and so on. They work best if you can partner with a government that actually tries to grow and develop the economy. Ghana has successfully used aid, and smartly, Bangladesh as well. And as I said, smartly, occasionally using the IMF when somehow politically it becomes really impossible to deliver within your own political economy. You call in the IMF, you blame them for everything, and actually perfectly good role. And it suits the IMF, it suits the country, it can actually bring that. So it actually, the international structures are designed to work actually with a benevolent government, with a willing government for development. And then I would actually say the international community should go further to give them a bit of room, a bit of space, not too narrowly say, you need to look like Beijing, or you need to look like Washington or like London, otherwise I won't support your economy. Then I think you want to be a bit more willing. And if you look at the success stories in practice, it proved reasonably possible to do that. although in theory and the noise made was often much less helpful. But what do you do then? Can you do it through conditionality? Of course not. If the elite doesn't really want to play the game, it will find a way around it. It's in charge. You can come in, put on the conditions. You look at Pakistan, 23rd IMF program, 22 of them have failed, meaning they have never been fully completed. Some people say, oh, one of them did. Okay, I take it, even if it's 1 out of 22. So now, successful countries, they complete a program and then they move on. You don't have a history there in Bangladesh not doing that. They would do the program and then they complete. In fact, they never make much noise about it. They do it, they complete, they go on. Okay, so that's the way you should look at it. If you then say, and of course the Pakistan one had endless conditionality. And in fact, it's been every time the same conditionality, in fact, 22 times, and it never gets delivered. And so you do still get, a totally closed economy, not really looking openly. It doesn't work. If you don't want it to work, it won't work. So, and then it becomes simply, in fact, it risks actually, even in the smartest countries without a development bargain, with quite a non-developmental bargain, they play it even further. They do just about enough what the IMF wants. That's stabilizing the economy, and then they don't do anything else. That is, let's not name them, although a couple spring to mind. Because that's the smartest one. Because actually, it is in the elite interest, especially if you have once you're settled yourself and you're quite happy with your exchange regime, whether it's flexible or fixed, then you call in the IMF, you know exactly what you want. Help me to stabilize within that regime. They do it, help you stabilize. Of course, it's in the elite interest, because I stabilize my currency, either the pressures on devaluation go away, I've done a bit of it, but it won't go further, or I've done my float in a managed way, and I got the resources to help to do it, and I can still pay for the school fees for my kids in France or in Europe, and it's fine. And in fact, very senior officials told me recently on the back of the book and saying they were beginning to wonder whether sometimes they're not complicit in non-growth development bargains, because they're only interested in macroeconomic stability. Look, that's the elite's interest as well. They love stability. So, but growth is the one that disrupts, and so they don't do it. So, that's a bit like it. So conditionality, that game, you do need the objective of that country. They need to want to do it. That's, I think, essential. And then, as an aid organization, your role, you have to be much more humble. You can try to do a little bit, if Nigeria wants to reform the National Petroleum Corporation, maybe help with that, or central bank improvement, let them help with it. You can do bits and pieces because they're the building blocks of a better development bargain. You can do it. But don't think you can run multi-billion-dollar aid or concessional finance successfully, because you're just giving the elite excuses not to do anything.
Fantastic. And just to remind the participants, if you've got a question, you can type it in and we'll elevate you as a panelist to ask your question. I see Dr. Ndumokolo, your hand is up. If you can please go ahead and ask the question.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Stefan, for the book. So my question is on, when you argue about gambling in development, so how can you align this with the political settlement theory, especially in countries where, even though you think you have an elite consensus, such an alignment among the elites where political settlement are not really taken to a level where elites are fully integrated in making decisions, or one part of the country or some part of the country are left out. It in turn affects the way democracy and peace are driven. Can you tell us how you think political settlement can help, the development gambling to work together? Thank you.
Sure. So there's the question on political settlement, but I also have Hilary. Hilary, if you can ask your question as well. Hilary, you're muted. Okay, so maybe we take those questions while Hilary figures out the technology.
Very good. So, just, there's two bits here to that I should answer. So first of all, there is, of course, the whole body of work around political settlement theory and political settlements as a framework in political science analysis. So my concept of elite bargain is quite close to it. I didn't end up using the terminology in the same way, because I think often political settlement makes it all too much about politics only. I think the elite bargain, I need to, even though it's politics, and it's about politics, often about rent capture, you need to think through how the economy functions as well, the whole functioning of the economy and the whole thing. So it can't just about the political deal, it has to be fully about the economic deal as well. There's some nuances there that you could say political settlement theory does it and so on, but it often looks at it in a very particular way. The other part to why I don't use that language, because settlement gives the impression of it's all settled. And the language is that it is an equilibrium, that it is actually a stable equilibrium. I actually like to think of it in a kind of, there are multiple equilibriums possible, and actually they can be disrupted by actually realignment of that equilibrium. So sometimes people talk about that is the political settlement, as if it is the only possible at the moment in time. And so it undermines actually the agency of the elite players, that actually another alternative is possible. Put it slightly differently. I take, for example, issue in the literature on political settlements in Nigeria, that the second coup of 1966 was unavoidable and that the outcome was predetermined. Sometimes you get that impression it had to be like that, and the rest is history, so to speak, in Nigeria, because everything follows from the second coup. No, actually, it wasn't at that moment necessarily clear that that would succeed, that would be the outcome, that would be the outcome. There were choices being made by some of these elite players. Yes, and these choices have consequences, but other choices are. So I just want to bring agency a bit more. But otherwise, actually, there's a lot of similarity here. It is about the underlying political deal that needs to be made, but it is broader than just the political class. It includes also the economic players, including the non-connected business. Their role is also important, and so on. So there is a similarity, but with some nuances.
Thank you. And Hilary, if you can hear me.
Yeah, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Yeah, my question is this. Are African countries not skewed on a downward spiral gambling trajectory, given the face that most African countries do not even have economic structure to build upon? That is my own question I would like to ask, because I'm worried that if you look at it, I mean, the economic history wise, a lot of African countries have missed that window upon which they can build on, I mean, a solid footing for their economy. Is it not going to, I mean, is there hope? Won't it continue like that? That is my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And there's Jonas Aja, if you can unmute yourself. Okay, maybe we take the question on the downward trajectory.
Yeah, so look, I think there is heterogeneity, actually. There's differences here, generalizing. In fact, one of the things that gives me hope is that in the last 20, 30 years, there is divergence in Africa, in the sense that some countries have been able to remain stable or indeed progress substantially, while others clearly are much more stagnant and more problematic. So that's the first thing, is that the observation that there is actually quite a lot of divergence there. But going further into saying, of course, at the moment, there is serious crisis. Now, that's all over the world, in lots of other places as well, developing countries as well there. But we shouldn't forget that a lot of the takeoff in a lot of places, not least in Asia, happened in the early 1980s. Which was a very similar time of global recession, of interest rates, debt crisis. Africa needed to do structural adjustment. Even when I referred to earlier, yes, Mauritius is a tiny place and don't get it. But I am struck that they took advantage of the crisis to do their structural changes and actually literally reformed their economies. In fact, we see that in Bangladesh as well, that these bad moments were used to begin to rethink slowly to some of that progress. So it's not self-evident, but the crisis, for the reasons we had argued maybe also earlier, is that it's often a moment where a realignment in the elite can happen and where there can be a beginning of some change. Can I also finish it on that point as well? The geopolitics, of course, has changed dramatically. But the real interesting thing is this change in geopolitics will again have some countries taking advantage. I see, any country that's trying to break into international value chains, this is a good moment because something that hadn't happened, which is that value chains were leaving China, now probably in the way the geopolitics is playing, actually a lot of Western countries will look elsewhere. So there are actually opportunities within this crisis to actually rethink the way you do it. It's not self-evident because it is basically short-term pain likely for longer-term progress. But let's not underestimate that actually in recent decades, countries have actually managed to do that during periods of crisis. So I take your point, and there's all kinds of issues there. And maybe a final point on that is, even though that you say they don't have economic structures to fall back on, per capita GDP on the continent is considerably higher than it was in 1981. So actually, you're hitting this crisis actually with GDP per capita considerably higher, which would suggest structures that are slightly differently, and there's definitely much more resilience. So actually, I am not a pessimist around it. There will be countries taking advantage. I simply can't name which ones, but it will happen. And I'm actually envisaging in the next 10, 15 years, more divergence in Africa. Some places where they get their act together, where they take advantage in a modest way, not Singapore-like growth, not South Korea-style growth, but they will take advantage, where others will actually miss the boat. And you'll get much more divergence inside Africa.
Excellent, excellent. Well, it's my pleasure to invite Professor Tunji Olota to join this conversation. Professor Olota is the Executive Vice Chairman of the Ibadan School of Government and Public Policy. He's a professor of public policy at the Leeds City University and author of several books on public sector reforms. He retired from the Nigerian Civil Service as a permanent secretary and is currently at the prestigious Nigeria Institute of Policy and Strategic Studies. Professor Olota, if you can take a few minutes to make your intervention, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. I've been in the air. I'm happy to get the last bit of Professor Dercon's. Are you hearing me?
We can hear you.
Okay. So I'd like to congratulate Professor Stefan Dercon for the unarguably landmark seminar contribution of his book to development theory and discourse. Indeed, the answer to the old question of why some countries like Nigeria remain poor while others stumble on the path to growth and development is the dominant issue of our time, making the treatise so timely. Gambling on development indeed enriches the other dominant development thesis, such as Jeffrey Sachs, that the developed world through foreign aid and technical support can afford to raise the poorest out of extreme poverty. As a Moglu and Robinson, argument that a country's institution is critical determinant of success or failure. And of course, the whole Mazreba Protestant theory, ethics and the undercurrent of culture and values. I dare say that Professor Dercon has taken Chinua Achebe's reductionism, that the trouble with Nigeria is simply and squarely the failure of leadership, to some height of theoretical sophistication, with a central argument that growth will happen. I'm sorry, I'm just hanging somewhere at the airport. Will happen when Nigerian elites sincerely and purposefully gamble to bring development about. In other words, for Nigeria to develop, our elites must make a bargain between protecting their own interest and the interest engraved in higher purpose. That's economic progress of the country. Now, it's clearly deepened the popular characterization of Nigerian elite regarded as strong in their rhetoric regarding commitment to national progress, but whose action and behavior are driven by objective other than development. Nonetheless, Professor Dercon, like Achebe, is saying that leadership matters and that such leadership will be meaningful if it works to build bridges and forge consensus on the Nigerian project. In other words, what Nigeria needs is a concert of critical mass of elite game changers who, propelled by vision to create a nationalist space, the type that the likes of Lee Kuan Yew created in Singapore and East Asia, and the type that is celebrated in Indonesia and Bangladesh, Botswana, and some Rwanda in Africa. So, what is the strength of Dercon's thesis? That whereas history matters, but Nigeria needs to escape from determinism of such historical causalities as slavery, colonialism, center-periphery, structural imperialism, mindset. I also agree with Prof that with all the potential value of foreign aid, they are not determining factors, as Jeffrey Sachs would argue. Indeed, international aid, as Professor Dercon rightly argued, can only help when Nigeria can muster the intellectual self-confidence and competence to write its own development agenda based on local reality, local expertise, and local perspective. I'm also fascinated with the caveat in his thesis, Elite Bargain, which I coined in my own writing as elite nationalism. That such bargain should not just be rhetoric, a concerted move to recalibrate the state and transform it into a truly, developmental state. We speak to the capacity of the elite to create a nationalist space for generating ideas and plans that people cannot get through elections. In other words, elite bargain thesis is strong and valid because the option available to Nigerian elite is very limited now. To start with, the so-called elite revenue, oil revenue that is sustaining the indulgence is drying up, and Nigeria is virtually regressing into bankruptcy. And also, I'd like to say that there is no ideological fault line for which to think the future of Nigeria. But what are my critiques of Professor Dercon? Professor Dercon is indeed asking the elite, in a manner of speaking, to be born again, short of committing elite harakiri, to bat a new generation of leaders to get Nigeria back on track to a more definite future. I dare say Professor Dercon obviously downplays the influence of popular participation, which in some sense will be the outcome of civil society vigilance and bargain at some other level. It also underestimates the complex sociology that potentially entrench owners of Nigeria, quote and unquote, godfathers, and wealthy Nigeria, the billionaires and the principalities among the elite, has created over time, created by the state itself, who will resist such a creative destruction that the end point of such bargain might portend, in preference for the governmental affairs and business as usual. So, if I still have like 2 minutes, I'd like to say Professor Dercon elite bargain would nonetheless make absolute sense if Nigerian elite can take the lesson and engrave the values that propelled their counterpart in East Asia and other high-performing developing worlds. Indeed, their newfound elite nationalism through bargaining must successfully institute leadership by example, one that must shun culture of impunity, which in Nigeria is the status symbol for having arrived, the big man having power with fidelity to constitutional order and the rule of law. We also need ideology and value. The Asian Tiger took advantage of Confucian tradition to discipline their development process and with strong technical rationalism in policy management. Within a national managerial culture and value that thrive on zero tolerance for mediocrity, and strong concession in resource management to thrift, savings, frugality, waste management, and zero tolerance for corruption. Besides, they discern clearly that neoliberal approach to economic policy will further lock their countries into unequal international political economic dynamics, which dependencies, within dependency structure. So they chose the development state paradigm. Why not closing up on policy input from external development partners? They subjected received doctrine to deep action and policy research interrogation and embrace those that serve their country best interest. As I conclude, Patrick, while putting much emphasis on democratic principles, we can learn from the Asians. They embrace a bit of the Machiavellian streak, discipline those that will stand in the way of progress. They are ever thinkers and were open and desirous to drive development progress with evidence-based approaches to leadership. They have upgraded their think tanks and the research community in their country. So I will end by saying that we should join in echoing Dercon's thesis in Nigeria is that we need a Nehemiah complex in our elite in Nigeria. When Nehemiah heard about the broken wall of Jerusalem, he broke down and lamented what was then obviously an institutional matter. The wall of Jerusalem was significant to the well-being of the city. It was a serious breach of protection. But then that was not all. He didn't just lament like we are hearing our elites do in Nigeria. He acted. It was only when he put his act together, gets a compelling team, and moved to rebuild the wall that, So Carl Pearson, in the book, The Transforming Leader, 2012, puts this even better. He said, and I quote, "First, if we want to make significant and long-lasting changes, we must look within before we look without, by bringing our inner self." So again, what the federal government is doing, the change begin with me, resonates. Our elites must, begin to, ingrain a new mindset, which will entail cognitive redefinition, initial frame disruption, and personal and relational realignment. And all this requires from the change leaders some significant quantum of honesty, integrity, and leadership by example. The whole change begins with me mantra, rebranded and given deeper content and meaning in a national journey to change the mind of the nation through deliverance experience of the leader first, and by dint of example and deep spirituality, propel vision and committed, the nation can be delivered. If I'm hard, that would be but I've articulated about 1,700 words article. I'm fearing that I might not be able to intervene. I've asked some of my editors to publish, and I've shared some with Patrick. I hope you'll be able to share with the participants so that they can get the meat of my contribution. I thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Professor Love. Thank you for everything you've done to juggle delayed flights and everything, and to still find a cubicle in the airport to deliver your intervention. I have shared the newspaper publication in the chat room, and I'm sure we will take time to read and digest it. But really, thank you for joining. And if you still have a few more minutes to be with us, we've got 15 minutes to the end. I'll really crave your indulgence to hang on as we get Professor Dercon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right.
Excellent. So, Prof. Dercon, maybe you've got some reflections on.
No. I mean, well, first, enormous thank you, and it's these are very thoughtful and beautifully written comments. I want to just respond in one or two things. There's a lot of agreement here, and it's actually quite interesting, and it makes me think as well. And so the first one is that, I think I played a little game with my readers, probably consciously, which is actually playing up the role of the elite and saying not enough about how popular pressure, civil society, and so on can act. When I was writing the book, I thought a lot about it. And I got a bit worried about, and also in my professional work and my advisory work, we go too quickly in the belief that civil society can change things. And of course, they have a role to play. But the one thing about the elite is that they have blocking power, because they like the status quo and they can block. So why in the book I pay not enough attention, and you know, there was a comment there, and maybe it was a gentle critique on the book as well. I had another reviewer from Sweden very strongly objecting to my book because I didn't say enough about it, is that my big concern is that we sometimes too easily think that popular pressure can change. You know, in my experience of a lot of work of the kind of interventions, for example, that the UK was supporting in civil society transparency initiatives that actually worked quite well in Ghana and Kenya, we had virtually no evidence that they ever worked in Nigeria. You know, and someone said, well, actually, because the political class doesn't give a damn. Doesn't have to take this into account. And it comes back to some of the comments Sam makes, is that you need to already somehow have responsive politics to be able to do this. So I totally accept that I overplayed maybe the role of the elite and underplayed how the popular role could be, popular pressure can play a role, because I do think it does, and it is important. But I wanted to do it to almost get that kind of reaction, that people started really thinking, we've forgotten sometimes how powerful elite players can be. And of course, it links to a second point that I want to quickly pick up from, which is really appreciated, that I underestimate maybe somehow the role of the Godfathers. And in fact, I've since learned a little bit more about actually, and in fact, my visit last week in Nigeria, we had conversations with some of them, and dare I say maybe some of them that were close to somewhere in the room as well, you know. But I also don't, again, you know, we make them as powerful partly through money, but you have extremely wealthy people, even in countries where a development bargain is acting. But we also give them the power because we allow them to control the politics. Or at some point is saying it's now my turn because I've paid enough for the others to run. And at some point we'll get, you know, two very big men now being two of the leading candidates in Nigeria. Now, the sociological factors in a powerful way. In fact, someone in one of the events in Lagos, someone raised the point and saying, look, it's probably only a couple of traditional leaders, a couple of godfathers, a couple of ex-presidents and so on. The elite is small. There's 30 people, 40 people or whatever. There is a group like that, no doubt, and we can probably all fairly quickly name them and quickly agree of who the 30 would be. But I actually would argue the elite is bigger than that, because their position is there because the others allow them to be. It comes back to that Stockholm syndrome. A lot more, several hundred, maybe some thousands, maybe even more, allow them to be because they allow the system to operate. So even though it's there, the big man problem and so on, I would argue that existed in East Asia as well. And we should be very careful not to overstate that it's all culture. You know, I do see change in African countries, even within cultures that are more familiar to what we see in Nigeria. So we shouldn't, I don't want to overplay Confucianism because, you know, for a long time, Confucianism existed and nothing changed in these countries. So at some point, it needs again the agency, it needs again that context-specific mobilizing aspects in your culture. And to reduce Nigerian culture or West African culture or African culture in general, as if they don't have aspects to play into, I don't want to buy that. You know, we have European cultures, very different places and so on. You know, Max Weber said it was only Protestantism, and by God, actually, you know, I come from a Catholic country. They also managed to grow at some point. You know, it doesn't have to be a simple thing. I think you need to find a way of mobilizing these factors. And it comes back to the answer I gave to Sam. You know, build your narratives around the things that actually are positive values in your society. That's how a clever commander-in-chief, communicator-in-chief, politician plays around these development, build around it, and use them for the better. But it's not that I don't want to recognize these constraining factors. They are constraining factors, and I totally appreciate the comments made that critiques should be had, and that Nigeria is a complex place. But I will end by thanking, and I will read with so much more care the comments made, and I will definitely take them into account. And I will also tweet them around and distribute them further as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Stefan. Let me take just two quick comments or questions from the participants, and then we'll do a closing comments. Akinade, if you can go very quickly.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. I think listening, thank you, Professor Dercon and Professor Olapa and Engineer Madi. It's been an interesting panel. But I think one of the things, as Professor Dercon said, is Nigeria, we put a lot on the elite. And I think for me, personally, I think the elite is a lot much broader subset of people. I think for Nigeria to develop and to get to where we need to go, those of us in the business community need to be more proactive in who the leaders are that we get to rule us. They've taken, the business elite has taken a seat back, and this has allowed a subset of people to take over the political limelight or the political power, making decisions that they don't understand about, that is impacting everybody. So until the business elite really get tired of the problem of infrastructural deficiency, insecurity, and begin to question those that hold offices, we're not going to get to where we're going.
Excellent.
And also, just to summarize, also is a lot of the participants are talking about the East Asian, but what people forget was back to the 1950s and 1960s, Western Nigeria was actually ahead of the Asian nations where they were coming to look at the economic development that was going on in our part of the world. What we've lost is we've lost those kind of leaders who have vision, who understands how the economy works and are able to put things in place. So we need to get back to that place where our leaders not only are after the political power, but they're also interested in the development of the economy and also the security of the state.
Fantastic.
So the infrastructure is there. We just need to step up and do it. Thank you.
Let me put in Ike Konkwo to make the final comment or question, and then we take the closing remarks. Ike.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all. I'll try and be as quick as possible. Just to check, can you hear what I am saying?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so given that Nigeria also faces environmental degradation, for example, oil spills and gas flaring, and desertification from the north, basically what I'm saying is that there are other challenges that are I wouldn't call them human, but that are applying pressure. How does that play into the concept of the political elite gaining consensus? Does this not cause pressure to pry them apart rather than get them to that consensus that we all desire? And quickly following that, do any of the other countries we've referenced as reasonably successful, did any of them face this environmental/human problems simultaneously? And if so, are there lessons that we can learn from those? Thank you.
Fantastic question. Fantastic. Thank you so much. I don't know how we do this. Maybe ask Professor Dercon to respond very quickly. We take some closing remarks from Sam and Professor Lotta, and then come back to you to make your final one.
Right. So look, I'm very quickly, and I will quickly comment on it. So the first point on what Akinade was actually mentioning, so I totally agree. You have in Nigeria, as in a lot of countries, you have often a small business elite that makes a lot of money from the connections to the political class. You have another business elite that makes a lot of money from ignoring the game and behaving as if nothing is happening, because they can build it up. Both of them play a big responsibility, and especially the latter has fallen asleep, it feels, behind the wheel, because they benefit a lot from that kind of other elite, even though their behaviors has nothing to do with them. So I totally agree that the business elite needs to be acting. The second point on the East Asia thing and Nigeria being stronger at some point, the one thing I want to say is that I want to underplay as relevant for Nigeria, East Asian countries. These were unique circumstances, both in the global economy. These were states with well-defined pre-colonial boundaries that had looked in a particular way, states with a particular history that took advantage of something at a particular moment in time. I think countries that now need to take off can learn much more from the Bangladeshis of the world, from from different states in India, from even Uzbekistan, and indeed also look around in Africa, very different ways that Rwanda, Ethiopia, the Ghanas, and a few others, Senegal maybe, are doing the things. You don't ask yourself too much, getting Singapore growth to getting Lee Kuan Yew in Nigeria, that's probably overreaching. You don't need to try to do it. You just need to do better. 2-3% more growth that is not based on oil. I would actually be happy. Development indicators that move in the right direction, that would be progress. The final one, whether other countries have faced this environmental climate kind of damage. Yes, of course. Why did Henry Kissinger call Bangladesh a basket case in 1981 and nothing would come from it? Well, actually, it already started to change. It was because of a history of flooding and climate-affected crisis, combined with massive population growth. That's not very different from what we could have a narrative about Nigeria, about environmental damage in the north with huge population growth. Actually, that was the kind of context where Bangladesh started changing the whole thing. Ethiopia is known for massive droughts and environmental crisis. So actually, it's a similar thing. It needs the same type of mindset of wanting to progress and to develop and to build your resilience through economic progress that actually is needed, whether there is these crises or not. Because in the end, this is a collective action problem. These environmental, the oil spills, all these things are collective action problems. It needs that same kind of collective behavior. Let me stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Professor Lotta.
Thank you very much. My last take is that even for the viability of the elite bargain across the ethno-linguistic divide, Nigeria actually needs a change space model, which I think compels that we rethink our federalism. There is too much wastage on massive 36+1 bureaucracy that is adding nothing to progress. And so we need to actually embark on significant governance reform that will actually create a space for even a leader to perform. The second thing is that, like I said before, the elites have very little option. NSAS signals the potential for Arab Springs in Nigeria. So there is a need for the elites in Nigeria to wear their thinking cap and really tread the viability path before the keg of gunpowder blows up. The last is that, I don't know, lately I started thinking that with the deepening poverty, with rudderlessness, misgovernance, and the extent to which we are playing politics with the destiny of this nation, I still think a military coup that might unleash a running option. We don't pray for it, but certainly makes those quote and unquote the owners of Nigeria to really think a future that is viable and that can really put Nigeria where the place of its destiny. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Prof. Again, thank you for all the effort you made, despite all the challenges, to join us on this. Dr. Sam, final comments?
Thank you very much. I think, let me say first that I think the development bargain can actually be, or works now as a form of explanation for the historic China-India puzzle. I mean, why Indian democracy is working and the democracy is not working there. An argument that Abatasi and others try to provide in terms of why democracy is inherently and fundamentally violent. But what I get from this is that, look, leaders can develop a good development strategy, build enough comfort around it, insulate it from conflicts and disruption, and drive it consistently over a measure of time, willing to course correct, make mistakes and reverse, and keep on that trajectory. Then it don't matter whether they're democratic or not, they would get result called development. I think he gives us a low LCM, low common multiple, basically saying it don't have to be a 20% or 10% GDP growth for 10 years, a decade like China or Korea. You actually have a development bargain that enables you, like I said, have a few, become an import-oriented country, increase their exports rather, improves their GDP out of oil, and then increase livelihood. So I think the big thing about this is that all societies at different points can actually enter. Now, the other issue around civil society, it seems to me also that development is more of a pragmatic, prudential engagement, a strategy based on awareness of your circumstance. A country with poverty, high rates, a country that is more authoritarian in norm, might find it difficult to have a bottom-up development. It will actually be more top-down. So the elites have some consensus and they can move this country forward. So yes, whereas we welcome civil society as a component, or it might be really maybe not realistic at the context we find ourselves to think that this transformation will be bottom-up necessarily. I think it's important to focus on the political elites and what is good about this is that functionally, we can see how we can incentivize them to pursue growth and development without fear or ideological transformation in their mentality and ideology. You don't really need to recreate them as born again, as Prof says. They don't need to be born again in that ideological, ethical sense. They can actually be made to see the short-term, the defeat of their selfish ways and benefit to line up to development. And then finally, I would like to say that this is practical because the patient aspirants, they are talking about development. They are talking about rescuing Nigeria. They are talking about moving us from consumption to production. They all are speaking in terms of a crisis. Maybe the strategy of a few who are more like provocateur is to deepen that cognition of the crisis such that this crisis cannot be solved or managed in the typical way, a perfect storm. And the only way for us is to move away from this trajectory and enter into it. So I think that development is ultimately a work of strategy. Sure. Strategy is about looking at leverage, finding the anchor. What is that lever you can use to steer things? And what is that message at the moment and the message? So that's why it's called a bargain. Many things can go wrong, but you need to almost like mythically put everything together and pray no serious aggression so that the ship can sail smoothly to happen.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sam. And final word from you, Professor Dercon. Yeah. So will Nigeria's elite gamble on development? Final word.
I'm an optimist. I can't be working on development in general if I'm not an optimist. And evidence suggests that countries surprise me. So I think Nigeria will surprise me sooner rather than later. I think it probably will need conscious action from the business elite. They will have to play their role. And secondly, I expect it probably to come maybe initially more from some states where things are beginning to change and governors acting in particular ways and becoming more examples. So a little bit from below. But then I think the realization, because crisis point will come. And I think, I am not a fan of military coups. I am not a fan of popular uprisings with capture and totally unexpected things. I think more in the political class will begin to realize that they will have to play a different game as well. And then more in the business elite and in other parts, we'll see that. So yes, I think they will gamble. I'm not quite sure when exactly, but I'm very hopeful.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Dercon, Professor Tunji Oloba, and Sam Amadi for making time to join us this afternoon to discuss this very important topic with Nigeria's elite, gamble on development. I'm also quite optimistic, that we can do it. We've done it before. There was a time when Nigeria was a pariah state and we returned to democracy. Crisis led us to return to democracy. Crisis led the elite to gamble on democracy. And within 4 years, within 8 years, we saw massive growth in our GDP. I feel we're at that point again, if not for anything, just the rhetorics coming out from the key presidential candidates points to the fact that they recognize that we're at a crisis point. And I expect that all of this will focus the mind to get us on the path that leads to development, and it's development that impacts the individual. And on that note, I thank you very much for joining us today on this development discourse, and we look forward to doing it again. Thank you very much.